and brought forth in sin. Man's will was not in any way free according to the doctrine of Pelagius, but was instead in bondage to his sinful nature. As a result of the fall, given the opportunity to choose between good and evil, God or the devil, the unregenerate man would always and freely choose evil and the devil unless God himself intervened. Pelagius, as well as anyone who followed his teaching, were condemned as heretics. The decision of this council reads in part, "Whoever says that Adam was created mortal and would, even without sin, have died by natural necessity, let him be anathema."
The Scripture says that the wages of sin is death. Death was promised as a result of disobedience. And one of the chief evidences that we are all sinners, and it is set forth all the way through Scripture, is that death is a common occurrence. Physical death, which is an indication that we all are living in a corruptible state of spiritual death. Well, when Pelagius and Celestius taught that men were mortal from the beginning and would have died whether they had sinned or not, this seemed to remove the what was a biblical evidence for the veracity of God in placing the curse on a disobedient humanity. If unfallen man had died anyway, then that means that the threat of God for disobedience would have been basically nonsense.
To our modern pluralistic ears, declaring that someone should be anathema or accursed for holding a sincere doctrinal viewpoint sounds bizarre, even unchristian. Again, Dr. Nettles responds.
Well, when these councils in some of these decisions would let him be anathema, they're picking the phrase up from the biblical example in Galatians 1, where Paul talks about, if anyone preach a gospel to you other than that which I've preached, let him be anathema. In other words, let that person be cut off from the church, but the real meaning is let that person be cut off from the possibility of salvation. Because Paul understood this to be something that was a destruction of the gospel. And so when the church uses that kind of language, whether or not it's legitimate for a church council to do that is another question, but what they're trying to say is that this is an issue that is so important that we feel that if a person believes this, they actually are destroying an essential aspect of the gospel. And so it is better for that person simply to be cut off from the church than to allow them to continue to teach and have the possibility of destroying souls.
In total, 3 councils condemned Pelagianism in all its forms. 6 years after the Council of Carthage, a General Council of African Churches reaffirmed the anathemas of 412 AD. Unfortunately, in the interval between these 2 councils, the Bishop of Rome, Zosimus, sided with Pelagius. In 412, he wrote a letter condemning the council at Carthage for their anathema of Pelagius. Of course, understanding that they had the support of Scripture, the leaders of the Carthaginian council disregarded the bishop and his letter. Philip Schaff, noted church historian, observes, "This temporary favor of the Bishop of Rome towards the Pelagian heresy is a significant presage of the indulgence of later popes for Pelagianizing tendencies." It was these Pelagianizing tendencies, advocated by the Bishop of Rome, that allowed for the later development of the works righteousness in the Roman Catholic belief system. This can perhaps be best illustrated by the life and writings of Cornelius Otto Jansen, a leader of the post-Reformation movement within Roman Catholicism. Most of his works were published and became popular after his death in 1640. Like Martin Luther, Jansen believed that the Church of Rome had departed from the early church's position that all of life was by the grace of God. And, like Augustine, he taught that man's spirit was dead in sin and therefore needed to be regenerated, what the Bible called born again. Jansen understood that this experience was something that happened to man by God's grace, and not something that a man made happen by his faith. On behalf of the Pope, the Jesuits launched a violent attack on the Jansenist movement. In 1713, Pope Clement XI issued a papal bull or formal condemnation against them, denouncing 101 statements from their writings. What's troubling is that many of these statements were direct quotations from the writings of Augustine against Pelagius. How could this happen to a church that at one time sided with Augustine against Pelagius? Surely there was more than just one answer. But Philip Schaff has given us one slice of the pie. As the church continued into the Middle Ages, and the Bishop of Rome became the so-called, quote, visible head of the church, end quote, these Pelagianizing tendencies metastasized and like a cancer began to spread. By the time we reach the Reformation, Rome was teaching that man saved himself by cooperating with the grace of God, a position known as semi-Pelagianism.
Then along came the mediating view of the semi-Pelagians that said man is neither dead nor well. In this life, man is born sick. Now, if man is born well, as Pelagius said, all he needs is a little guidance, a little moral guidance in his life to stay upon the path. If man is sick, then he needs the help of a physician. And if he will cooperate with his physician, then he and the physician can effect his cure. Augustine said that man today is born dead in trespasses and sin. He needs to be resurrected. That we are totally incapable of doing. So the practical result is if you are a Pelagian, all you need is a teacher. If you are semi-Pelagian, all you need is a little help from a physician. If you are an Augustinian, as I am, and most all of the historic Orthodox Church has been, then you will realize that man needs to be resurrected from the dead, and that salvation, furthermore, is entirely of grace.
Semi-Pelagianism is a modification of the doctrinal teaching of Pelagius. It is a synergistic rather than a monergistic approach to redemption. It basically teaches that man and God are cooperating together in order to accomplish redemption.
On September 1st, 1524, Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam, a Roman Catholic apologist, published a work entitled Diatribe Concerning Free Will. Martin Luther, the German reformer, responded with On the Enslaved Will, or The Bondage of the Will, a masterful apologetic that referenced over 300 Bible verses. Luther maintained the full Augustinian position against the semi-Pelagian position of Erasmus. It would be difficult to overstate the significance of this book. Luther considered it to be his most important work because it spoke to the issues that went to the very heart of what it meant to be a Christian. Dr. B.B. Warfield, the great Princeton theologian, called The Bondage of the Will the manifesto of the Protestant Reformation. Luther's book drew a line in the sand between the Roman Catholic view of justification and the Reformed view, and the debate that followed became known as the monergistic-synergistic controversy.
When Erasmus wrote his diatribe on free will, he was writing this against Martin Luther. The church had really knew that Luther was making some inroads, and so they wanted the greatest continental humanist to take aim at Luther. Erasmus hesitated for a long time, but finally he found what he thought he could conscientiously focus on, and that was Luther's recapture of Augustinian thought that we are absolutely and utterly dependent upon a sovereign working of God and that we have nothing to contribute to our own salvation. And so in this book, Erasmus opted for a view of salvation that says that God offers us grace, but we still have some elements of freedom within us by which we can either choose this grace or reject this grace. And it is our choice that God rewards then with salvation.
Erasmus's main thesis in his treatment of the will, this diatribe on the will, is that man has the ability to initiate the relationship with God through faith in Jesus Christ. He has the ability within himself to believe, and through that faith then access all that goes with faith in justification and reconciliation with God.
Dr. Askell explains the semi-Pelagian view of synergism.
Synergism comes from a compound word in Greek, together, working together, and it basically teaches that man and God cooperate in the initiation of faith, that man does his part, God does his part, and so it's a cooperative work.
The prefix sin means with or together with, at the same time. It refers to two or more. It's used in words like synchronized. Ergos is a Greek word for work. In theological terms, as Dr. Askell has already noted, synergism refers to divine and human cooperation. God and man work together to bring about the latter's conversion. Martin Luther saw this as little more than a works-based salvation, dressed up in evening clothes. Luther believed the semi-Pelagianism of Erasmus denied original sin, the full impact the fall had on man. Instead of being dead in his trespasses and sins, man was, according to Erasmus, only wounded, and therefore could help himself by helping God. Luther understood that Erasmus' view made the grace of God a reward for our faith. In other words, man believes the gospel, and as a result of his good work, God gives him grace. And no matter how you slice it, in the end, man deserves some of the credit or the glory for his salvation.
And so it was the glory of God that was at stake in this view of salvation, according to Luther.
Against the synergistic view of Erasmus, Luther believed that being born again or born from above was monergistic. Mono is the Greek word meaning one or alone. It's the prefix for words like monotheism, the belief in one God. Monergism then was the belief that regeneration or the new birth was to be understood as the work of God alone. Because man was dead in trespasses and sin, it was God and only God who brought man back to life, sending his Spirit to revive, regenerate, and resurrect man from the hopeless condition of spiritual death. It may be helpful at this point to briefly explain that the terms born again and what we deem as salvation or justification are not synonymous terms. Many modern-day Christians equate the two. Luther emphatically taught that fallen man does not have faith in order to be born again, but that man is born again by the Spirit and the Word, and as a result, has faith.
Luther rightly understood that when the Bible describes the condition of man in sin, it is a desperate condition. Man in sin is not just sick, he is dead. A sick man can help himself a little bit, but a dead man needs a supernatural, miraculous work of grace to bring him back to life. Luther recognized that, and